Amiri Baraka was made poet laureate of New Jersey not not very long after, not very long before 9/11. Like it would be about, I guess, early 2000s. Um, and this was a tremendous honor, and it was something that had been earned over the years, I should say. So Baraka represents one of the great African American poets and playwrights, incredibly controversial figure, a figure who would would was constantly challenging the status quo and had a curiously interesting experience as a poet and a playwright. He grew up in New Jersey, lived in New York all his life, and grew out of a very activist kind of situation. He went to Howard University. In fact, went to Howard University with people like Toni Morrison, Melba Moore, singers and artists who he had friendships with and developed friendships with. Baraka was interesting because during the 50s, he became part of the Beat movement. He was one of a couple black writers who were recognized as part of the Beat movement. That's the poetry Beat movement. And his influence was highly shaped by jazz music. And he was clearly a student of jazz, a great writer about jazz, a great critic about jazz. And one of his most famous and really seminal and brilliant books is called The Blues People. And Baraka was always performing in improvising ways and became part of the Beat movement, which was usually associated with West Coast hip movement. But this is with poets like Allen Ginsberg and there's a whole cluster of them that had great fame in the early 60s, the late 50s and the early 60s. Baraka, in his whole life at that time, he was married to a woman who continues to live, and she continues to be a very interesting writer, Hetty Jones. They got married. She was a Jewish American woman, and they were married for a number of years. But interestingly, at the time in 1964 was when the Dutchman was produced and performed. They were going through a separation and a divorce. He had two children with her, and they were going through a separation and divorce. And I think it's interesting and worth paying attention to their biological story, even as we're looking closely at the text. And one of the things he mentions at the time and has done in retrospect is to say that the reason for that, so one of the reasons why I think he perceived that the marriage was not going to work was political, he said. Because, of course, at the time, Baraka was beginning to be one of the key figures in what will now be known historically as one of the great movements of African American poetry, the Black Arts Movement. And the Arts Movement produced people like Gwendolyn Brooks, Baraka himself, Hakeem Madabouti, and Ed Bollins. There were many writers and artists who at the time began to emerge during that period, and they came out during a period of black resistance, black rebellion, and black is beautiful as a kind of thinking and a way of seeing the world and so on. It is fair to say that there are three major movements in African American poetry and African American literary life. There's what we call the Harlem Renaissance, which was characterized by people like Du Bois and Langston Hughes and so on. And then, of course, we have the Black Arts movement in the 1960s, and then finally what we see in a period of African American poetry, led by the movement of an organization called Cave Canem, that arguably has formed the more contemporary journey of African American writing. So Baraka therefore was a leader in the Black Arts movement, and at the same time he was writing this play. He began to work on this play during his radicalization, his more pro-black engagement. He writes the play Dutchman, Dutchman has interesting success. It had some success on Broadway. It's a short play, and so it has success on Broadway. It also was made into a film, and you can actually go on YouTube and watch the film. That is a very sort of interestingly done film because, of course, the play is very tightly done. It's a single scene. It takes place in a subway train, and therefore it's easily managed in the film. The film stays within that space and looks at it. And the play was controversial because of course, the way that it tells a simple and interesting constructed story, and it's one that we would pay some close attention to as we think about what Baraka is really getting at and what Baraka is actually trying to talk about in the midst of that play. We will talk of. We'll also see that the title of the play, the Dutchman, references a sort of a myth, the Flying Dutchman, and is associated with the idea of a ship that has gone astray in the world, and the ship is losing its ground. There's a way in which the Dutchman, what happens inside the play on that subway station, a play that is the idea is that the train is actually out of control and is going astray. But the microcosm of American life is taking place inside that play and in that moment. Baraka would produce a few other plays, but really became better known for his poetry, and continued to develop that work with his poetry. I mentioned that he was made Poet Laureate of New Jersey. But something interesting happens at that point, after 9/11, is that he writes a poem called Who Blew Up America. It's actually a collection called Who Blew Up America. And he performed that poem um, at a festival, a major festival. And in the poem, he really questions he asks a fundamental question, essentially, is who is responsible for 9/11. Essentially, that is his question. Those are volatile days, and the very idea that he was actually suggesting that there were other forces involved in 9/11 that were associated with more than just associated with the people who were currently being at that time being whether it's Afghanistan or whether it's the Iraqis. That very thought was seen as anathema and a huge problem. The governor of New Jersey at that time decided to ask him to step down from the position as poet laureate. And of course, Baraka refused. And it turns out that there was no statute in 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 Jersey, in the Jersey law and legislation, that that with which they could remove him from the position of poet laureate. So consequently, they eliminated the position of poet laureate altogether. They could do that, I'm not even sure whether there is still a poet laureate position in Jersey at this time. They may have reinstated it. Baraka is a very interesting figure. He died a few years ago. His son, of course, became mayor of Newark, and became a leading political voice in Newark as well. So when we get to when we in the next section, we will look at the play itself.